الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. My name is Sophia, I'm your host. The aim of Let the Quran Speak is to help you gain deeper insights into Muslims and Islam, as it is practiced here and in other parts of the world. In this episode, Resisting Pornography. How can Muslims avoid viewing pornography given its prevalence in this part of the world? We'll be exploring this subject shortly, but first, Palestinians in Gaza have been locked in conflict with the Israelis recently, and news of the conflict has dominated the airwaves. The Israeli government and many other Western countries have blamed the Gazans and asserted Israel's right to defend itself. In this episode, we shift focus to the difficult life circumstances of people in Gaza, much of it imposed by Israel's blockade and control of the region. Here to discuss life in Gaza, Dr. Shabir Ali, President of the Islamic Information Center. Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
Now, we've heard a lot about the Gazans in the news, but we haven't really heard about the humanitarian situation there. So I thought we should focus on that. Do you have any thoughts to begin?
Yes, an article written by Diana Batu appearing in the Globe and Mail recently describes her first-hand experience. She is a lawyer and she served as an advisor to some of the important organizations in that part of the world. So she lived there for some time, and she describes how memories of the bombings, just the sound of bombs, continue to live with her many years later, after she had left the region. So we can well imagine the situation on the ground there for children growing up. A large percentage of the population are below 20 years of age. So what it must feel like for the children hearing this sound of bombings. Someone who has lived there for a great part of his life detailed to me how his sister used to pop balloons just to convince her children that the sounds that they're hearing are similar to balloons popping and therefore must be harmless, so that they do not live in fear. And then the children grew up a few years later, and they now make fun of their mom because now they can recognize the fear in their mom. As the sounds of these bombs are going off, and now they're saying, well, wait a minute, Mom, those are just like balloons. What are you afraid of? So the situation there is difficult for us to imagine because we live in another part of the world in which things are peaceful, and we have the freedom to go out and to live as we please. But to live under occupation and to live with this blockade and the constant threat of bombs falling around you is a very difficult life indeed.
Obviously, this conflict has taken a toll on the Palestinians in Gaza, but of course, even before that, their life was quite difficult. There was a blockade imposed upon them. There were limited goods allowed into Gaza itself.
Yes, to give some perspective on this, the Gaza Strip is a strip of land. That's why it's called a strip. About the width of Toronto, about 14 miles across. And the width of it is about the width from, let's say, Lakeshore Boulevard to St. Clair Avenue. So it's a very narrow strip. And the comparison here is apt because just as Toronto sits beside Lake Ontario, the Gazan Strip is on the bank of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's the sea on one side, and the three other sides are closed in, either with a concrete wall or with a very high fence. So this has become, in effect, the world's largest open-air prison.
Yeah, and there are 1.7 million people living there.
Yeah, so Gazans cannot come out without permission. They have to go through the border crossings. The nature of the land is such that they cannot farm animals on the land. The meat that they can use would come through tunnels. Because they're not allowed through the border crossing. So that method of bringing in the animals would obviously be very dangerous for the animals and also for the persons trafficking the animals. In many parts of the world, Muslims have recently enjoyed the festivity of the Eid al-Adha by sacrificing animals. And we know that many organizations have arranged to have the animals sacrificed in many parts of the world, including the West Bank. But this couldn't be done in Gaza because the prices there of the animals would be too prohibitive. And so we see that the Gazan people have become accustomed to a lifestyle that is very difficult, even for Muslims to imagine. Much less people who are not so familiar with either the region or with the Muslim culture on the whole.
Even specific spices like coriander and ginger are limited in terms of how much Israel allows into Gaza.
Yes. We became, at least the world population became aware of the limitations imposed on Gaza when we saw that humanitarians trying to deliver edibles and medicine into Gaza by way of the Mediterranean Sea were blocked off and prohibited from entering by Israeli forces. That just highlights for us something that would not have been brought to our attention, the fact that this Gazan Strip is so restricted. And as much as Gazans are restricted from going out, things are restricted from coming in. And one of the disturbing reports that came to light recently showed that some Israeli decisions were based on the calculation of how many calories per day would be necessary to sustain life in Gaza. And based on that kind of projection, the limitations and bans were placed on goods entering Gaza. This is rather challenging and disturbing for the world population. We have to look deeply within us, be very introspective, and ask about what we are as human beings. And how we see the world population, what kind of justice we want to be in the to be present in the world, and we are very active in our local scenes, trying to make sure that justice is being done. Whether we are taking issue with one of the actions of our mayor or something like this, we want to see that justice be done in every sphere. But this has to be global. It cannot be that we turn a blind eye to some injustice that is happening in some other part of the world while we are so keen on justice where we live.
So what do you think we should do, given that we live in the West? We're far away from Gaza. We're far away from decisions made about Gaza. What sort of things should we do?
Well, we should spread more awareness about the evils of war and these negative effects of war. To begin with, we ourselves should be firmly against war, and we should always be for peace. We see that in history, war has never led to anything good. One takeover is followed by another takeover. One military invention is followed by another one. One war is followed by another one. The defeated party doesn't stay defeated for long, but gathers strength and comes back fighting. So we have to change our way of thinking and try to solve our problems in peaceful ways, even though this often involves compromise, because that's how you solve problems, and that's how you make people come together, by compromising. If each person insists on what they want, then there is going to be war. We need to spread information about the evil effects of the past wars on the Gazan population, and look back at some of the atrocities that have been committed in past wars. For example, in the latest, in the 2008 ground invasion into Gaza, it was reported that white phosphorus was used in some of the attacks, and white phosphorus burns into the body. It's not just simply defending yourself anymore. This is going over and above just mere defense, and this is taking on quite an ugly form of offensive action. Look at the results later on and ask, what do our world's great religions teach about the loss of life? The Quran certainly tells us that if you save one life, it is as if you save a whole human population. And obviously, because that one life has the potential to generate so many more in terms of oncoming generations. In the 2008 invasion, there were 13 Israelis killed and 1,300 Palestinians killed. Apart from the lopsided nature of this loss, the total loss is quite shocking. And we should ask, why do we need such a thing? And why couldn't the powers that be just simply hold their hand and decide to make compromises and live in peace so that the ordinary citizen can have life?
So I guess we should also appeal to our government officials that they also change their stance so that they work towards peace.
Yes, and of course we often ask the governments, and we should continue to ask the governments to put pressure on the greater powers. So that the greater powers have to exercise greater restraint. What we hear about in the news often is that rockets are being fired at Israel, and of course that's bad enough. But at the same time, Israel has its anti-missile defense system, so that the rockets being fired at Israel are either intercepted and crushed before they can do any harm, or they are misfired and they do not actually reach targets that do much harm. So we hear about the Israeli citizens being terrorized by the sound of sirens and the threat of bombs being dropped. But on the what we're not focusing on, and the Western news media does not seem to have much interest in, is the fact that whereas you're hearing sirens on the one hand, and people are scared of that, and they should be, and this shouldn't have to happen to them. On the other hand, there are people being killed by bombs dropping around them.
And buildings being
destroyed, their own homes being destroyed. We've heard the real reports of people sleeping in their beds one night, and then 5 o'clock in the morning they hear bombs, the sound of bombs, and if that were not enough, there was a shattering of glass because their own windows caved in, broken by the sheer force of the bombs exploding nearby. Doors being torn off their hinges because of again the bombs, the effect of the bombs. And these are civilian homes. You cannot just simply say to these people, well, stay away from the military installations or any institution related to the government, because you're dealing here with a narrow strip of land. Where are these residents supposed to go? And here they're being affected in their own homes. Now, of course, these residents have had to vacate their homes because the homes are not livable anymore as a result of the bombing. So it is necessary for our governments to ask the powers to restrain their hand and not to abuse the power that God has granted them, because every power is granted only by God, and this is for a limited time. The powers will shift, things will change, and we can become the victims in the future of some shift in power. We have to remember God and turn back to Him and do what is right according to the world's great religions.
All right, thank you for that, Brother Shabir.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return. Resisting pornography.